So the second time that Mars was retrograde in Cancer was between the period of October 1928 and May 1929. So Mars entered Cancer on October 3rd, went retrograde on November 12th, left Cancer and entered Gemini on December 20th, went direct on January 27th and re-entered Cancer on March 11th, and then finally left Cancer on May 12th. So for clarification, the events that I'm covering in this video with these historical events, I'm covering this entire period of time when Mars transits through Cancer, not just specifically when Mars is retrograde. So from that period of Mars entering, going retrograde, exiting Cancer, and then re-entering, and then finally leaving Cancer, this entire period of time is what we're examining. So while the effects are the strongest when Mars is debilitated and retrograde, the energetic effects in general play out from when Mars first enters Cancer and then finally leaves Cancer after that retrograde period is over. And that timetable is about 6 to 7 months. So in this instant is a very crucial 7-month period of time in 1928 and 1929, which had an intense debate between the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York about how to control the intense speculation on the Wall Street Stock Exchange. So you can see this carryover when Mars was retrograde debilitated in 1913. 15 years later, the real effects of that law being passed are starting to really come to fruition. So this debate between the various Federal Reserve bankers and the regional Federal Reserve bankers was over whether to raise the discount rate of borrowing money to 6% in order to control the mania of speculative borrowing. And this debate happened during this critical Mars retrograde debilitated period. I want to draw your attention to what Adolph C. Miller, who was a member of the Federal Reserve Board from 1914 until 1936, wrote about the causes of the market crash in 1929. His 1937 paper, Responsibility for Federal Reserve Policies, 1927 to 1929, has a section titled Passive Policy in the Last Half of 1928. He uses very descriptive Mars retrograde debilitated terms, without consciously recognizing it, of course, in saying the Federal Reserve System failed to pursue affirmatively the policy of restraint adopted in the early parts of 1928. Taking the period from midsummer of 1928 until the early days of February 1929, the policy pursued by the Federal Reserve System may be characterized as a policy lacking in strong conviction, which he characterized by, quote, delay and inactivity. When he says restraint, this is another word for discipline, a trait of a healthy and strong Mars. He goes on, quote, its mistake was in waiting too long before assuming active leadership in firm intervention in the situation. A partial explanation for the hesitancy on the part of the board at this time, in the absence of proposals for action from reserve banks, may be found in the Federal Reserve Act itself and the tradition that had grown up in the system. This tradition was the initiative in credit policy should originate with the Federal Reserve banks. And finally, he says, quote, the board, under the established tradition, was first too quick to fall in with a daring and dangerous proposal, and later too slow to assume the leadership which was needed and was lacking at a most critical time, unquote. So what Miller is essentially saying, and what I attribute to being caused by the retrograde and debilitated Mars in the chart of the United States, was that the Federal Reserve did not act with discipline to restrain the wild speculation happening, and too quickly fell into complacency and hesitancy, and then acted too slow when initiatives should have been taken to assume leadership and responsibility to resolve a growing problem. Remember that Mars went retrograde in October of that year and went direct in early February, and it wasn't until February that the Federal Reserve Board began to realize it had a growing problem on its hands and needed to begin to act. Another explanation by the Federal Reserve was typed up in November 1930, detailing the critical dates when the bankers began realizing this, and those dates are between September 1928, heating up after February, and went into the summer. This paper details the debate and panic after the board realized action needed to be taken, and that policy was called direct pressure, and unfortunately it was too little too late. In fact, the market experienced a mini crash on March 25, 1929. It had become evident in the minds of many of the bankers by late May and June that the market would likely collapse on its own weight in due time. This period is a perfect example of what happens when a weak Mars goes retrograde, and we see all of the psychological symptoms play out in the collective policy decisions that led to severe and unintended consequences, the collapse of the market in 1929 in October. So while the famous Black Monday crash happened on October 28, 1929, which wasn't when Mars was retrograde and debilitated, the scrambling and the attempts to control the incoming chaos did happen during this critical period, with little that could be done to stop it. It wasn't until Pluto went retrograde within 1 degree of the United States' 8th cusp, the cusp of other people's money and resources, that the market finally toppled over. And Pluto had gone retrograde in that week leading up to that final collapse. So the third instance of this retrograde period was a much shorter period lasting just over 3.5 months. And Mars only actually spent a month and a half in Cancer between December 18th, 1930 and March 30th, 1931, when the US government was again scrambling about what to do to control the financial devastation and worsening depression across the country. So starting in November and December of 1930, another banking crisis took hold because of the Federal Reserve's actions of not increasing the money supply. So many people actually thought the economy would recover after the stock market crash a year earlier, but these bank failures that happened during this Mars debilitated retrograde period became the deciding series of events that would finally push the United States into the Great Depression. And it was the lack of action, again, by the Federal Reserve during this crucial period of time that worsened the economic situation in the country. Now, I don't attribute these bank failures as much to Mars's transit into Cancer, because as you can see, it only spent a couple of weeks in Cancer retrograde and then direct, and didn't touch any planets or the 8th cusp. But take a look at the major conjunction happening directly on the 8th house cusp, Jupiter and Pluto. On November 8th, Jupiter goes retrograde, and just a single day earlier, a banking services conglomerate, Caldwell & Company, which operated in the southern United States and was headquartered in Nashville, was the first domino to fall. They closed their Nashville branch, and within a week and a half, many of their affiliate banks also failed in cities throughout the South. On December 7th, a week before Mars would go retrograde, the 4th largest bank in the United States, Bank of the United States, also collapsed. But you can see during these tumultuous few months, tens if not thousands of people were thrown into the Mars retrograde psychological effect of panic, and you would guess emotional turmoil as well for having their life savings being evaporated. It was, again, a time of serious deliberation and emergency policies that needed to be deployed by the Federal Reserve to calm the growing financial storm that was happening throughout the country. So even though this period was extremely intense economically, because of that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction on the 8th cusp, I still consider Mars' impact to be somewhat minor in its effect, because it never actually goes and touches the 8th cusp when it's retrograde, which would have made the situation much worse. And this is a theme we're going to be seeing, is that when Mars actually touches the 8th cusp is when the most intense situations happen.